Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Welcome to day 5 of Teaser season for patch 0.4.0 and the Last of the Druids expansion, the Fate of the Vaal league content. Today, we're going to be talking about the changes Grinding Gear Games have made to the patch notes. Some of these were things that were already known. Some of these are substantial things that are new. We're going to go through each line of these, and also, in case you missed it, I did discuss my live stream reaction and thoughts on the patch notes themselves when they came out. Link to that down in the description below. That is the day 4 first video. And the second day 4 video was a bit of a summary of everything that we've learned so far from that live stream announcement, but just condensed down because the original live stream was something like 5 hours long, and I wanted to get out just what I thought were the biggest individual changes. So that's all linked to down in the description below. Also, you might have noticed my camera's changed a little bit. That is because the old one gave up the ghost, and I have a new one now. Thank you to the 2 people that sent in donations for that. May your Vaal have completely and utterly cursed results. Anyways, that covered 2/3 of the cost of it, which was really good. There's also some weird sound setting I've got to try and troubleshoot because at the moment my camera is not affecting my sound. It's not recording any sound, but it does seem to affect the sound. So I'm not sure what's going on there. That's something I'll have to try and work out. Let's discuss what is going on with these patch note changes, starting with something that is a big nothing burger for a lot of you that are watching this video, but that there are some people who are watching this and thinking, finally. I want you to ask a question. Did you enjoy the parry mechanic and find it underpowered, or did you just dislike the parry mechanic? If you're in the second category, these changes mean nothing to you. But if you're in that first category, you thought parry was a fun mechanic, really active gameplay style, but that it was just not good enough, well, that is being fixed. When parrying, you now hit all enemies in an area in front of you, in addition to the enemy who instigated the parry, and parry now always hits the enemy you parried, regardless of distance. So, when you successfully parry, you get to do a counterattack. This counterattack does quite a lot of damage, and it tends to be boosted as well, because there's a whole bunch of other shenanigans that go on around parry. Anyway, this is now going to do way more damage than it did before because it's going to be able to hit multiple targets. And that is the really big thing here. What this is going to mean is that the payoff for successfully executing a parry is going to be considerably higher than it was. I feel like there's an Expedition 33 style vibe where parrying in that game feels amazing because you get to do a massive counterattack and they often just do absolutely devastating damage. I think they're going for trying to get that vibe. I don't know if they've quite got it, but I feel like there's a real potential that that's where this is going. And additionally, you're not just hitting the one enemy, but you could potentially hit quite a few. The other thing to note as well is that this is taking place in the context of all of the endgame changes, particularly the endgame density changes. And those are going to be very substantial when it comes to making parry feel a bit better than it did as well. If you actually enjoyed the parry mechanic, but you felt it was not powerful enough to use, then this is a great change for you. These 2 changes combined. If you didn't enjoy it, you thought it was a trash tier mechanic, you hate the Huntress, you never want to play it again, you don't like spear skills, then you can completely ignore this because it's not really for you. The other change that's coming is also a pretty big one here, and this affects everyone. Sprinting no longer prevents heavy stun build-up decay. Firstly, what does this mean? This means that when you're sprinting, the current behavior is that if you take a bunch of little chip damage, so you get hit by a quill from one of those quill rats and it adds 8% stun bar. Then you take a hit from a skeleton and it does 13%. Then a little bit longer into your sprint, you take a bigger hit from something and it adds 26% to your stun build-up bar. Previously, if it was one continual sprint, you're now at 47%. You're now a good way towards copping a heavy stun. What's the new behavior? The new behavior is that you decay that heavy stun build-up, and that decay is going to be taking place while you are sprinting. So previously, that decay did not take place while you were sprinting. Now it will. When is this meaningfully different? This is meaningfully different when you are doing a very long sprint through mostly safe areas. So you're running through an area like the hunting grounds in Act 1, where there's a bunch of monsters that are still alive, but not that many of them, and they're firing range attacks at you. You take a hit from one of those quill rats, and it hits you for 8% of your stun bar, and a little bit of life loss. So you endure the life loss, neither here nor there, but the 8% build up towards a heavy stun is nasty. But then by the time you run into the next one, because you've mostly cleared the area at this point, you find, oh, I'm back to 3% stun build up. And you take another 8% hit, so you're up to 11. Then the next time you get hit, maybe you've decayed back down to 7%. So if you're only taking very occasional hits while you're doing your sprint, then you're not going to build up into a heavy stun. So this means if you're trying to run through a really contested area, you are definitely going to get heavy stun anyway. This is basically a godsend when you're running through an area that you've half cleared, especially when you're just trying to look for a point of interest in an area that you didn't find. So the better that you know area layouts, the less useful this is going to be. After this, we have some changes to the passive skill tree. Now, there are some changes to the passive skill tree that are meta-defining. There are some changes that are nothing burgers. And we have no idea with these first two which of the two it is. Added some additional parry-related passive nodes to the tree. Nice. Are these good nodes? Are they bad nodes? We don't know. Made some changes to existing parry-related passive nodes, including additional parry debuff magnitude. Nice. Are these good changes? Are they bad changes? No idea. So really can't say very much on those. Falcon Dive, though, we can talk about this one. So Falcon Dive is a notable that used to grant you 1% increased attack speed per 250 accuracy rating, with no cap on it. This is being nerfed for those of you with 3,000 or more accuracy, and buffed for those of you with less than 3,000 accuracy. So Falcon Dive now grants 1% attack speed per 400 accuracy rating up to a cap of 20%. The node also grants 4% increased attack speed as well. So yeah, the breakpoint is close to 3,000. The thing to note though is that actually it's about at 3,000 that you might start considering taking this node. So it's basically everyone that might have taken it, it's likely to be worse for. Everyone that wouldn't have taken it, it's likely to be better for, but probably still not good enough to take. Or if it is good enough to take, it's only just one of the weaker of the notables on your tree. So basically, Falcon Dive is pretty much getting a nerf there. Added 2 clusters with increased ailment chance to the ranger and monk sections of the tree. Are these good clusters? Are they bad clusters? Are they dumpster tier clusters? No idea. We're going to have to find that one out. Right, so let's talk about the changes that are taking place to Greatwood I and II support. Greatwood I support, Greatwood II support are being combined into Cyril's Cultivation, which is a lineage support. What did these do in the past? Here's Greatwood I. It essentially amalgamates all of your totems from that gem into one mega totem. That mega totem would then gain 5% increased AoE, 10% more damage, 10% more life per totem limit. So that was the identity of what Greatwood used to do. Greatwood II was the same thing, but more of it. And it was just basically a better version of the same gem. So Greatwood II goes away. Greatwood I is now Cyril's Cultivation, which is a lineage support. So this is one of those nerfs that I'm a bit surprised by at first, until I realized, that's right, they're adding new totems in. I think they don't want a situation where a support gem that actually significantly changes the playstyle feels so numerically good that everyone wants to use it. Instead, they want it to be something that feels like a genuine choice to use, and so they're making it into a lineage support, they're making it weaker than it used to be, so that people can use it if they want to, but most people will end up not using it. I feel like they might have pre-nerfed spell totems otherwise if they weren't doing this. At least that's my lead theory on it. They wanted spell totem to be tuned a bit better than it could be, while Greatwood II existed in the game. Next up, we have the Ambrosia supports. These are getting big time nerfs. So here's what these gems did. Ambrosia, the old version. Your skill drinks 20% of your flask's maximum mana charges when you use it. So that meant that it was something that was completely unsustainable. You definitely could only use this in situations where it was a skill you didn't use very often. And the supported skills gain 3% of damage added as extra lightning damage per mana flask charge that was drunk in this way. So if you've got a 75 charge flask, then 20% of that is going to be 15 charges. You're going to get 45% of damage added as extra lightning. Now, in practice, you didn't use flasks that only had 75 charges with this. You would use ones that had more. That is what old Ambrosia did. Ambrosia 1 is now a tier 2 support, and it is being nerfed to only drink 14% of your mana flask's maximum charges and only grant 2% of damage as extra lightning per charge consumed, down from 3% that it used to be before. Ambrosia 2 does more of the same, but actually at a less efficient rate. So it drinks 35% of your mana flask's maximum charges, which is a lot, and only grants 1% of damage added as extra lightning per charge that is consumed. Additionally, there's a later change here as well, and this later change is a bug fix, and it's a very significant one as well. Ultimately, Ambrosia is going to be something that I don't think very many people are going to use. The people who do use it, it'll be something that you'll have a skill gem that you don't often cast, and it's there as a way to just do an extra burst of damage when you need it, but it's not going to be used very often. That is the way that I would consider using Ambrosia now if you want to do so. And whether you use Ambrosia 1 or Ambrosia 2, that's going to be up to you. Ultimately though, I'd kind of be inclined to use something else instead. Magnified Area 2, this is getting an unconditional buff. It is going from 90% baseline damage multiplier to 100%, i.e. no change, the amount of damage that you do. It's still going to have its 45% increased AoE, but it's no longer going to have the drawback that's associated with it of 10% less damage. So while the other changes that have been made here in the support gem section have been nerfs, this one is actually a pretty substantial buff to something that was already probably good enough to use in many cases. All right, it's time to talk unique items. Dusk Vigil. This is getting a buff, and you'll see here that there's going to be a bit of a pattern. Anything that is a caster staff at the moment, they tend to get buffs. Anything that is a caster focus, they tend to get nerfs. And this is just more examples of this. So this is the interesting caster staff that doesn't get used very much at the moment, but it's the one that triggers Ember Fusillade when you cast a spell. It also grants you Firebolt as well. This is going from 60 to 80% increased spell damage. That is being boosted up to 80 to 120%, which is a pretty substantial boost. And on top of that, you're gaining 30 to 50% of damage added as extra fire. So Dusk Vigil is looking better than it did in patch 0.3.0. And particularly if you get one of the exceptional ones that has a level 20 Ember Fusillade on it, which is something that's reasonably hard to get your hands on. After this, we have Taryn Shiver. Now, Taryn Shiver is interesting. This is a item that requires buffs to be usable. It is getting kind of some buffs, but they're not absolutely strictly always better. It's an interesting combination of changes that are taking place here. Let's go through them. Firstly, the amount of damage that you inflict on frozen enemies is getting buffed, and that's probably the most important stat on it. And this is very substantial. This is going from 50% to 100%. So that change alone would be fantastic. However, there are also two other changes that are being made. Firstly, the increased cold damage on the item is now being changed to unconditionally increased spell damage. Most of the time this is a buff, but there will be the odd occasional scenario where it's a nerf. And then we have 100% increased freeze buildup is getting gutted. This is getting nerfed down to 30%. So we're seeing basically 3 lines of text changed. The first line of text is roughly as good as it used to be. The second line of text is getting massively nerfed. The third line of text that's changing is getting massively buffed. This is an interesting package of changes. Where do I think this leaves the item? I think it doesn't change it. It's not good enough to use currently. I don't think it's getting there as a result of these changes, mostly because it doesn't have plus to gem levels, and in most situations you can't get away with that. There is the odd scenario where you can, and that's in situations where you are triggering some additional skills off the staff, but that is not the case here with Taryn Shiver. Getting 100% increased damage taken by enemies, and note that this is additively stacking with shock, so it's a very, very strong effect. This is really, really, really good, but it's not probably enough on its own. At least that's my initial feelings on Taryn Shiver. Earthbound is next. Earthbound is one of the ones that feels like it could be usable because it grants a spell trigger. So even though it doesn't have any gem levels on it, it is granting this a level 20 spark trigger on it. That is something that's inherently very, very strong. In terms of changes coming to this item, Earthbound's lightning damage is being changed into spell damage. This is usually a buff, not quite absolutely always, and it is gaining 20 to 40% increased shock chance. All in all, definitely a buff here, especially given that you need to be inflicting shocks in order to get this, so you did need that extra mod. But whether it's enough overall is an open question. I'm not sold on this item, but I'm also not as dismissive of it as I am with Taryn Shiver. After this, we have the Searing Touch. Now, the Searing Touch is everything that is wrong with Ignite. This is kind of getting a lot. This is really way better than it was, but I don't think it is getting enough. So Ignite spread to other enemies that stay within 150 centimeters for 1 second. This is one of those lines of text that sounds so good until you remember that just because 1 second is not very long in the real world, 1 second is something like 3 words when you're speaking, or maybe you can squeeze in 6 words if you really, really want to talk fast. In Path of Exile, it is a very long time. This is 30 server ticks. And every one of those server ticks can have your life total yo-yo wildly. And by the time 3 or 4 server ticks have passed, you kind of want most of the weaker enemies to already be slain. So, where is this good? Where is this mod good? This is good if you're fighting 2 or 3 very, very tanky monsters simultaneously. This scenario does come up every now and again, and if you can fire an igniting skill on one of those enemies and then catch it over to the other 2, that's really good. There's no denying that that is a strong use of this mod. However, that's just not the situation when you're playing the game most of the time. There will be the odd scenario where this is a fantastic mod, but in general, it's not enough to use the support gems that do this, and it's not enough to use a staff that otherwise, I mean, it does have 100% increased magnitude of Ignite you inflict. If Ignite was to become good, this would help with it. It does have increased chance to Ignite. It's certainly got mods on it. This is a live item, but this additional mod is just not going to get there. That's my thoughts on the Searing Touch. What numerical changes would make this mechanic of Ignite proliferation / spread that exists in POE2 into something that would actually be usable? I think the number 1 needs to be replaced by something like 0.2. 0.2 seconds, I could see this being usable. It would still be miles weaker than all of the Ignite spread mechanics that exist in Path of Exile 1, where you can propagate and Ignite across the entire screen at something like 2 meters per 2 server ticks, but it would be something that might actually be usable. Anyway, that's the Searing Touch. Goes from not good enough to not good enough, but at least there's something interesting going on there. After this, we have a number of much more straightforward buffs. Carnage Heart. The increased amount of life leached on this is just getting better. 100% now, 100 to 200% random roll after the change. This is just a straight out upgrade. The Anvil is getting miles better because a hard to get stat. Maximum block chance. This is not a stat that you can get a lot of anywhere easily. This, you are going to get a lot of it on the Anvil. Now, block is something that a lot of people don't like in Path of Exile 2, but also the people that have played extensively with it do tend to like it. So I'd say that this is one to keep your eye on. But it's a very straightforward numbers buff. There's no real complexity going on there. Next, I want to talk about Seeing Stars. So, Seeing Stars is having a base change and it's having a bunch of numbers changes. Let's talk about what this item does first, because it's one of those complex ones. Seeing Stars is a low-level mace base. Level 26 mace. Now, it does quite a lot of damage when you get it. It has cold damage, it has lightning damage, it has increased attack speed. This is a phenomenal leveling item at the moment. Well, guess what? It's no longer going to be a good leveling item at all. Instead, it's getting changed into something that might be an endgame build around. Energy generation is doubled. There are a number of triggered skills that this is absolutely fantastic on, and they're going to be doubling down on that with the changes being made. Essentially, Seeing Stars is getting something like 90% more damage, but it's also going to come online. I believe it's level 55, the base that it's going to be, but the physical damage on it, the cold damage and the lightning damage on it, they're all being raised by about 90%. And this may or may not make it into an endgame item, but it's definitely no longer leveling only trash like it used to be. Dream Fragments is next. Dream Fragments is a very straightforward numbers buff. It is going from 10% to 10 to 15% increased maximum mana. This item was massively, massively, massively overpowered in patch 0.1.0. It then got crushing nerfs. So it went from 20% in this increased maximum mana stat down to 10%. And at that point, even though it was a very rare unique item, basically no one wanted to use it at all. What I think Grinding Gear Games are trying to do is find a sweet spot. Find a sweet spot where this is a semi-chase unique, something people are really excited to see drop, but also not something that's so good that people don't want to use anything else. That's what I think they're going for here. Whether they hit that or not at 15%, I just don't know. Remember that they did buff Archmage last patch. Again, Archmage is not back to the level it was at 0.10. And all in all, there's a package of changes that are going on here that mean that Archmage without Indigon is picking up a number of buffs here. We'll come to Indigon in a sec because Indigon is getting a big nerf. Treefingers is next. I really like seeing this sort of thing happen. This item is just gaining a chunk of strength on it. This is a not very exciting stat, but it's a sort of stat you've got to get somewhere. And sometimes, in the best case scenario for this item and this buff, this is going to be 4 additional passive skill points because you're no longer going to need to tie up 4 points on attribute highway nodes to get that strength. That's the best case scenario for it. Most of the time, it's going to be a weaker effect than that, but it's pretty much always going to have some impact. Getting attributes somewhere is mandatory. and getting them on an item that you're already going to use is actually quite a substantial buff to that item. Of course, that statement is predicated upon that line that you're already going to use. If you weren't interested in using Treefingers without this line, you're probably not interested in using it now. But this is still a pretty significant improvement to the item. Ghostmarch is next. Ghostmarch is a set of leveling boots. It wasn't really a set of leveling boots because it didn't have movement speed on it. Well, now it is going to have movement speed, and it's got a level appropriate movement speed. You'll be very happy to use these from the time that you can equip them at level 16 all the way through to maybe level 45 or so, at which point you'll be very happy to unequip them and replace them with something that is more suited to that phase of the game. Greymake is next. This is just such a funny, unique item. Like, this item is absolutely terrible late in the game, but it is actually very strong when you get it. So it has this line of text on it, -1 to all attributes per level, which is a pretty nasty drawback in general. And it's coming alongside an item that just gives you a bunch of attributes. So at the time that you get this, it's kind of pretty strong. But then it very quickly has this built-in decay of its power. Well, Greymake is now also going to drop with 4 augment sockets. Existing items won't have this change. This is going to mean that it's going to go from kind of A tier item in Act 1 to an S tier item in Act 1, but then it's going to already be B tier by the end of Act 2, start of Act 3, and it is going to be absolute dumpster tier by the time you get to the middle of Act 4. So don't hold on to this forever, but definitely if you do happen to own one, stick it on early because it's going to be really good. Right, so we've been talking about a bunch of items that are sort of leveling items that are getting a bit better. Here we've got something that was a fringe usable endgame item. So we have a look in 030, then you can see that there were people that were using Powertread. We're not talking even 1% of the player base, but there's definitely a number of people, including a lot of them, that were level 90 plus. So there's definitely some power on these boots. What do they currently do? Well, they currently give you +1 maximum power charges, 12% critical damage bonus per power charge. All of that stays. What's changing? Just one line. 10 to 15% increased movement speed is becoming 15 to 20%. Here's what I think is going on here. Groningen Games looked at this item that they thought the player base would like, and they see no one really considers it endgame loot. Some individuals do, but just not very many. And they've thought, well, it needs a small buff. It needs more movement speed because it's not quite there. It's not competitive with rares on pretty much any build. So we're just going to give it a little bit more movement speed so it's less behind on that most critical of stats. Where do I think this is going to be? I think this is going to end up, if you're playing critical strikes and you're scaling power charges, this is going to be one of the best set of boots that you can get under 10 divines. Once you're rich, you're probably going to want to graduate onto something else, maybe move other stats onto your boots and focus on getting that critical damage bonus back from other sources. So that's going to be what you'll do long term. But early on, I think Powertread is going to be something that is much more usable than it was in 030. And whilst I'm saying much more usable, it was actually usable. There were people who were using this item, but that number is going to go up a lot, all because of a very small buff, 5% increased movement speed. Sometimes the small buffs to an already good item can have more of an impact than a big buff to a terrible item. The Bringer of Rain is getting 2 lines of text, and they're not consecutive in the patch notes, which is a little bit confusing. So it's now going to drop with 4 augment sockets, and it's also going to have an interesting line of text. This item gains bonuses from socketed items as though it was a body armor. Existing items won't have these changes. So this is just changing around the way that this item works quite a bit. It is generally speaking going to be a buff. There'll be the odd corner case scenario where you would wish that you could get an older version of it, but of course you're not going to be able to. But ultimately, this is generally speaking a buff. It's going to be interesting to see whether this is enough to get people over the line into using it. Effigy of Cruelty is next. This is one of the best foci in the game, and it is not going to be quite as good anymore, but it is still going to be good. So the increased spell damage on it, that is getting nerfed. It is currently 60 to 80%, and post-nerf, it is going to be 40 to 50%. Remember what we said? Staves across the board, unique staves, are getting buffs to their offensive capability, and all of these foci are getting nerfs to their offensive capability. Now, these are the less impactful changes, though, to staves and foci. The more impactful one is going to be Rathpinth when we get to it, and the earlier Rathpinth changes, and all of the changes that are taking place to the stronger caster staves. Whispering Ice, for instance, is probably going to be a chase item this league. Next up, we have Hyrri's Ire. This is getting an unconditional and a big unconditional buff. 200 to 250% increased evasion rating, previously a 100 to 130. This is a big deal. Hyrri's ire goes from good to better. Rathpinth Globe. Rathpinth Globe is getting a couple of nerfs, but this is one of them as well. Non-channeling spells deal 6% increased damage per 100 maximum life. Previously, this was 10%. Essentially, this is part of that thing where foci are getting made worse offensively and better defensively across the board. The better defensive side of it is that the focus's base energy shield rating will increase, but that is not intended to be a huge amount. Instead, the intention here is that staves are buffed to just below what a wand and focus was in the past, and wand and focus is nerfed to just below what a wand and focus was in the past. The Vertex is next. Now, this one's really interesting. So, currently, this item has equipment and skill gems have 50% reduced attribute requirements. Attribute requirements are somewhat more oppressive in Path of Exile 2 than they are in Path of Exile 1. If you looked at this item in POE1, you would say, hey, this is absolute and utter trash. But in POE2, that may actually save you a fair number of passive points. However, what Greymake games are doing is changing it to be much more of a vertex rather than just a flat 50% reduction. Instead, it's going to be a 100% reduction for one of those categories and no change to the other one. So this is either going to read equipment has 100% reduced attribute requirements, or it is going to read skill gems have 100% reduced attribute requirements. When you want this, in two scenarios. The first one is you're stacking a single attribute, and then you're trying to use level 20 versions of certain gems that are a different attribute. So for instance, you're stacking intelligence for some reason, and you want to use level 20 skill gems that are red. In that situation, the Vertex is going to be an absolute lifesaver. It's going to prevent you from having an enormous amount of attribute difficulties in order to get those gems in. The other scenario in which you might want to use this is if you want to use a defensive package that doesn't align with the color of your skill gems. So maybe you're playing a build that is primarily using red gems, but you want to primarily use intelligence gear because you want to stack energy shield. Maybe you are one of those Titan builds that is chaos inoculation. Well, in that situation, the Vertex comes along and bails you out. Either it can bail you out of the strength requirements, or it can bail you out of the intelligence requirements. You pick between the two of them. And it's Editing Gog here pointing out that actually there is a third use, and it's probably the most important one yet. That is, what if you've got really oppressively high attribute requirements, perhaps through the use of Giant's Blood? Well, maybe you can solve those. I don't want to call this a buff, I don't want to call it a nerf. This is just a change. Sometimes it'll be better, sometimes it'll be worse than it was, and it's really going to be build dependent. Ultimately, you're going to build around 040 Vertex differently to how you did to the past versions of it, and you're going to end up with a different looking passive tree. Sometimes that'll be better, sometimes it'll be worse. So when we were talking about Dream Fragments earlier, I mentioned the name Indigon. Dream Fragments gets buffed, but unfortunately, Indigon pays the price. In fact, Indigon is paying a massive price here. This is a big set of nerfs to this item. 10 to 15% increased spell damage for each 200 mana you have spent recently. Previously, it was 35 to 50%. This is a more than 2/3 nerf. This is one of the two nerfs this item is getting. The other one is to the skill cost increases. So that is going to be 5 to 10% per 200 mana, rather than 35 to 50%. Now, there were weird corner cases where that second nerf is actually a buff, where you wanted your Indigon to be a bit more stable. Those are weird, those are corner cases. Most of the time, both lines of this are stacking compounding nerfs. This item is a lot worse than it was previously, and it's probably still so good that it's still usable. That is just the way that Indigon has been in the game so far. Right, so let's have a Last Lament for the Last Lament. This crossbow is getting a nerf that is really a bug fix, but it's one that does delete the primary use case for it. So let's go through exactly what's happening. There's a line of text on this. Sacrifice 300 life to not consume the last bolt when firing. What's changing? Well, the Last Lament unique crossbow now only prevents the final loaded bolt from being consumed if the character actually sacrifices life. What does this mean? Well, if you're playing one of the Lich builds that was using this, and you'll see that whilst quite a number of people were using the Last Lament in Rise of the Abyssal, they were an absolute majority Lich ascendancy. That's because the Lich has a notable that causes your life to be unable to change when you have Energy Shield. So as long as you've got Energy Shield, and I believe at least 301 life, then the game tries to sacrifice the life and gives you the benefit of sacrificing the life at the moment. Now, that is not the way that most people would expect this to work if you're familiar with the way that Path of Exile works. Whenever a trigger condition comes up, if you can't pay the cost, normally the trigger doesn't go off. That works with Path of Exile 1, that works with Path of Exile 2 as well. Essentially, the Last Lament was breaking all of the rules. As I said, there were two ways Greynake Games could have gone. Greynake Games could have said, right, we're going to cause you to lose 300 life and then the last bolt doesn't fire. That would be one way they could have worded it. And then in that case, the Lich interaction would work. Or alternately, they could do what they're doing, which is make it so that the interaction doesn't work. Anyways, long story short, in 030, this was almost certainly a bug, but it did work. In 040, this interaction is not going to work. That said, there are still builds that use Last Lament and that are not on the Lich Ascendancy. So you'll see here, there's a bunch of Ritualists using it. And then there's a whole spectrum across a lot of different Ascendancies that were also using it as well. So it's definitely something that is still a usable item. It's not dead, but it is no longer chase. It is no longer semi-chase. It is no longer quasi-chase, but it is still a serviceable, usable item. So it's interesting there in that we see a number of buffs, a number of nerfs, and there's no real clear overall balance between them. It's more a bunch of changes rather than an overwhelmingly buff-heavy or overwhelmingly nerf-heavy patch. There's both up and down for a whole suite of different builds there. Now we have the item changes section. Now this one has a lot of text, of which one line is really high impact, and then the rest is much less so. Omen of Homogenizing Exaltation and Omen of Homogenizing Coronation have become drop disabled. Now this was mentioned in the Q&A that Greynake Games did on Friday. And I'm calling it Friday because I'm Australian, but 3 days ago when they did the big live stream announcement, it'll be Thursday for those of you that are in the United States and similar time zones. They mentioned that these were going away because they were a type of complexity Greynake Games didn't like, where you needed to go to external resources in order to figure out how to craft anything. And it was definitely my experience that if you wanted to plan a craft with Homogenizing Coronation, Homogenizing Exaltation, Omens, that was exactly what you did. You sat in front of POEDB for a while, you investigated 6 or 7 different orders you could go in, and eventually worked out a recipe. Then, depending upon the type of person you were, you either kept that recipe to yourself and crafted dozens of the item and listed them all for sale, or if you were a little bit more altruistic, you would publish the recipe. Either way, anyone that had your recipe could then bypass all of that time that you spent sitting and staring at POE2 DB. Well, Greynake Games mentioned that they don't want to have that sort of complexity where you're dependent upon external resources, and that was part of the reason they decided to get rid of these things. Obviously, a lot of players who did go through the work of learning those crafting methods really, really love them, and I think this is going to be one of those interesting nerfs. There are crafting nerfs that are very much targeted at the top couple of percentage points of the player base. So for instance, if Greynake Games were to decide we are removing Omens of Sinistral Annulment from the game, that would be a nerf that would be very, very tightly targeted at the top couple of percent of the player base. Instead, this is a nerf at the upper middle section of the player base. If you are someone who is a top 0.5% crafter, you're probably fine with this change. You'll be able to make things you wanted to make without these omens. But if you're in that 2nd through 30th percentile, the sort of people who get the Arbiter down in week 2, those sorts of players are going to find this is going to make crafting substantially harder to engage in than it was last patch. There's definitely going to be a change that is going to be a lot of people's least favorite line in the patch notes. As for me, I am looking forward to one thing about it, and that is that it's no longer going to be the same crafting flow for almost everything. Generally speaking, in 031, your crafting flow went like this. Firstly, recombinate 2 mods together. Secondly, do some combination of homogenizing exaltation with perfect exalts or abyssal crafting in order to then build out the rest of the item. That was the standard crafting flow for pretty much everything. Now it's going to be up in the air. I'm looking forward to that up in the air situation, but I'm a bit worried that we're going to end up in a situation where fracturing orbs are just completely dominant. So fracturing orbs will become a lot better as a result of these changes. That's the other thing that should probably be mentioned here. It's not that fracturing orbs were bad last league, it's that they were inferior to homogenizing exalt shenanigans, and now homogenizing exalt shenanigans are gone, fracturing orbs are going to be much better. So that's probably the single biggest change in these entire patch notes. This was mentioned on Friday, but we've got it confirmed in the patch notes because Greynake Games forgot to put that line in on the Friday original release of the patch notes. After this, we have a number of changes to crafting bases and weapon bases. Now, if we wanted to quickly summarize these, we'd say very small buffs to Gothic and Sinister Quarterstaves, but not anything overwhelming. You'll notice the Sinister Quarterstaff does lose just a tiny bit of damage there, but it is less than 1%, and that's completely fine because it's gaining that back and more in the critical hit chance. Even if you are not a critical hit build, this is still going to end up as an upgrade overall. Barrier Quarterstaff, Guardian Quarterstaff, and Aegis Quarterstaff are now getting an improvement to their block chance. And then the Hefty Quarterstaff is now doubling down a little bit on the slow but hard hitting aspect. The key way that it's doing that, though, is not so much by doing more damage. It's only getting a little bit under 1% damage increase, and it is paying a price for that. That price is that it is losing something like 3.5% attack speed. However, it is gaining back some power through this new 20 to 50% chance to daze on hit as an implicit. Is this going to be better or worse than the existing Hefty Quarterstaff? I think for most people, it's going to be a bit of a wash. The main reason, though, that they bring up the Hefty Quarterstaff is they're adding a new endgame Quarterstaff that's going to have the same implicit. After this, we have a number of changes to bows. So we have the Cultist Bow, the Adherent Bow, and the Fanatic Bow. Every single one of those is getting a nerf to the amount of chaos damage that it does, and a buff to the amount of physical damage that it does. Essentially, these items were paying too much of a price in the amount of physical damage that they do for the amount of chaos damage that they do. So essentially, this is intended as a buff, but I don't think it's enough of a buff to make these into good bases even during the campaign. You might use one if you just happen to get good explicit modifiers on it, but it's probably going to be starting behind the other bows that you could be getting, and you're not that likely to craft on them when you do get one. Ultimately, not very impressed with these particular bow bases, and we'll definitely come to another base that's been performing slightly higher in a second. These are getting an unconditional nerf. After this, we have the changes being made to the top-end bows. Now, Dual String Bow, Twin Bow, Gemini Bow, these are all getting the same changes, and these changes are overall quite the nerf. I'm not going to call what's happening to Lightning Arrow death by 1,000 cuts, because I don't think the build is going to be dead, but this is Lightning Arrow being suppressed by 1,000 little cuts. None of these individually would really have much of an impact on Lightning Arrow. Overall, I think it goes from overwhelmingly the best league starter choice to a very viable league starter choice. If you like the skill, feel free to play it, but if you don't like the skill, don't feel pulled into it anymore. And that's because of all of these little changes. What exactly is happening here? You're going to gain 4.5% more attack speed, 1.1 to 1.15 attacks per second, and that's with all of these bows. However, instead of 100% chance to fire +1 arrow, you're now going to get 50% chance to fire +1 arrow. The way that this is worded, 50% surpassing chance to fire an additional arrow, is a bit cryptic. But what it means is that once you exceed 100% chance of this, you then wrap around. So if you go from 85% chance to fire 1 additional arrow, that's pretty obvious. 85% of the time you fire 2 arrows, 15% of the time you fire 1. But then if you get 50% surpassing chance, you go up to 135% chance. What does that get interpreted as? Well, always you're firing 2 arrows, but you've got a 35% chance to fire a third one. And if you were to have 770% surpassing chance to fire an additional arrow, well, all of the time you're firing 7 extra arrows, but 70% of the time you'd also fire an 8th additional arrow. That's what this stat is going to mean. Cutting a long nerf short, Dual String Bow, Twin Bow, Gemini Bow, halving the effectiveness of the additional arrow that you're getting, and going to compensate partially, but very, very partially, by giving you 4.5% more attack speed. All in all, this is a nerf. It's not a crushing nerf. None of the individual nerfs are to Lightning Arrow, but they definitely all add up. Microtransaction changes, this is a big quality of life one. Stash tab affinity for Abyss items. You don't need an Abyss specific stash here. You can just use a normal stash. In fact, that's what people are going to do. You can just say, all right, all of my Abyss related items, all my preserved bones and the like, they can all go in this one particular stash. Bug fixes. Here we have 2 that relate to the row amount. One of these is an out of combat boost. So it's a quality of life improvement. It is that you couldn't previously pick up items or interact with objects while you were on your row amount. Generally speaking, this doesn't make you more powerful, but it will be a quality of life improvement that it's fixed. However, fix an instance in which you could gain the benefits of a row amount while you are dismounted. This is one of those bug fixes that is a nerf, although it's not really intended as one. It's fixing up something that's clearly unintended. And then after that, we have, I think we mentioned earlier when we're talking about Ambrosia 1 and the new Ambrosia 2, that there was a bug that was making these stronger than they were intended to be. They're now going to work the way they're intended to, which is when you use a skill that is linked to Ambrosia support, it will drink Mana Flask charges, and only if it's able to drink as many as it wants does it have its effect. After this, there's a section called Updated Patch Notes. Now, the Updated Patch Notes is something where Grinding Games have made changes where their original version of the patch notes had one change, and they've come along and then revised that change. So here we have the Mountain Splitter Ascendancy passive, and I believe the change here is that it previously said it only created 2 additional aftershocks as well as the actual slam skill itself. That's now going to be 3 additional aftershocks, so that is better than it was, I believe. And this is something that is a 4-point node, so it's going to want to be quite good. Okay, so the next thing that's coming up is the changes to Queen of the Forest. Queen of the Forest is getting quite a bunch of overhauls here, and what Grinding Games look to be intending to do here is to set some limits on how good it can be, but also make it better before you're at those limits. It was not providing you a movement speed bonus when you were sprinting. Previously, it was only granting you movement speed based on your evasion rating, but previously it also did not have a cap on it. Now, it's going to start you at 25% movement speed boost. That can scale up to 75% movement speed if you can get 30,000 evasion rating on your character. If you get partway there, then you'll get partway benefits. And on top of that, it is also going to turn off other modifiers to movement speed, such as on your boots. Now, this change does not affect existing items other than to apply the cap and the constant 25% increase, but the other stats that are there can be updated using a Divine Orb. So a bunch of little changes are going on that item, but Queen of the Forest, very, very strong item potentially. What I really want to see is exactly how this works in conjunction with Krangle Divining. So that is when you apply a Val Orb to an item and its explicit modifier magnitudes change. For example, can 75% change via Krangle Divining? I would expect the answer is no, but I'm open to being proven wrong here. Can 25%? I would expect the answer is yes, but again, I'm not sure. Can 600 change? I believe the answer will be yes again here, but again, not 100% certain. This is something that we'll no doubt find out pretty quickly. Once people have a couple of Queens of the Forest in the new league, we'll be able to find that one out. There are some very small changes that are taking place, more just refinements to existing changes to certain weapons. So you'll see, for instance, Grinding Games have decided the Flying Spear needed to be made better, and various other spear bases, just getting little tweaks here and there. These are intended to give weapons different identities to each other, but also make it so that even if you're not really interested in a particular item's identity while you're leveling, it's probably still going to be a buff. That's their goal. So you're going to go from a level 40 to a level 46 spear, even if the level 41 had a better implicit for you than what exists at 46. And I think they want to do that across all of the different weapon types as well. And really, that's the rest of what we've got here in these patch note changes. So a quick summary of what we've got here. The biggest changes realistically here are going to be ones that apply to the Huntress and to spear builds in general. They are getting the most small changes overall. How big they are is kind of hard to say because some of these are going to live or die based upon your personal preferences when it comes to the parry skill. Whether you like the parry skill or not, then if you do like the parry skill, you'll probably find these changes to be great. If you don't, it's not going to incite you into playing them. Additionally, there's just a bunch of things where they're saying, hey, guess what? We're changing some things on the passive tree, but we're going to let you find out what they are later. So those ones are not going to be big changes. But when it comes to the changes that are being made to unique items, whilst there's not very many in this package that are really exciting, there are a lot in the patch in general. And who knows, Dream Fragments might well come back as a result of these changes. And additionally, 1 or 2 of the other uniques here might get there. I feel like Seeing Stars probably doesn't get there, but getting something like 90% more damage on it, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong on that. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up getting there. Likely, the Bringer of Rain is getting big boosts as well. There's a lot of things going on in terms of uniques. It'll be really interesting to see everything when we've got the full passive tree, because that's going to be the really decisive moment. I am going to leave it there. May your Val Orbs have the results you deserve.